Good evening, everyone. Hi, welcome to the latest in our Sunset Series. Don't know whether you heard all of that sentence. Thanks for unmuting me, Michelle, when you muted everybody. Yeah, so the latest one of our Morecambe Bay Partnership Sunset Series. Yeah, we're really sort of proud, I think, happy to be hosting these events, which feel to have struck a bit of a chord for everyone while we go into lockdown and then worse lockdown and in and out of lockdown and sort of back to where we started nearly a year ago. These events were conceived originally because obviously as Morecambe Bay Partnership, we pride ourselves in a community-based approach. So, you know, we're here to look after the heritage of Morecambe Bay, both the natural heritage and the built and cultural heritage and all things in between, but also celebrating the bay and its specialness, promoting access to the bay and around the bay. And so much of our work involves volunteers and working with the local community to to sort of find out, research our heritage and then look after it. And that's been really, really difficult through lockdown with all the social distancing and other rules. So these evening talks were a way of keeping in touch with our supporters, and in some cases, launching projects or doing training. We really have had a very broad broad approach, broad sort of subject matter on these talks. And I think really, I know that lifelong learning is one of the 5 keys to happiness for people. And I think for me, that's what's been really good about these, is that they've been interesting, different, and they've sort of been a way of all of us really opening our minds to new topics, as well as coming together and sort of, giving us a way of staying connected and giving us something to do. So thank you very, very much, all of you, for joining. Great to see so many familiar faces and names, but also, we're still attracting new joiners from all around the world. I think the last week's, I think, was, or the one from a fortnight ago, was we had well over 100 people, and a really large sort of North American contingent. I did wonder whether maybe prehistoric tracks were on a syllabus somewhere, for, I don't know, university syllabus or something. But tonight we are back talking about natural heritage, natural environment, and we have Stephen Lipscombe, who is the project officer for the Back on Our Map project, which is hosted at the University of Cumbria, but is a partnership project involving other organisations, including us here at Morecambe Bay Partnership. So thank you, Stephen. I'll just introduce you in a second. Michelle, who works for Morecambe Bay Partnership and is the one that says Morecambe Bay Partnership on the screen, is also involved in the Back on Our Map project from a Morecambe Bay Partnership perspective. So I'm sure that when we get to the end and you'll have lots of questions, then as well as Stephen answering things, we can hopefully, we have other people here who can help as well. So Stephen, I guess without further ado, I know you're going to do a bit more of an introduction about yourself and who you are and where you come from. But yeah, I think we're all really looking forward to finding out a little bit more about the rare species that you're bringing back from the brink.
Brilliant. Thank you, Tom. And just say thank you for the invite, Tom and Morecambe Bay Partnership, to come and chat to everyone. You would have heard from one of my colleagues a few weeks ago talking around the dormouse reintroduction that Boom is also doing. So yeah, it's nice to come along and talk about the slightly, in some might say, slightly less sort of charismatic and dramatic species, but as far as I'm concerned, these are equally so, and I'm going to enjoy talking about them tonight. So yeah, as I promised, a little bit of an introduction to who I am. So my name's Stephen Lipscombe. I am project officer on the Back on Our Map project and have been with the project now for about 1.5 years. Prior to this, and currently, I also work for Northumberland Wildlife Trust on their Kildahead Wildwood project. And before that, I was a University of Newcastle master's student. And prior to that, I was an industrial research chemist. So it was a huge change in direction about 6-7 years ago. I decided to actually follow my heart and get into conservation, really with an idea of working with landscape restoration work, and that's really what the two projects I'm involved in now are all about. So I feel very, very privileged to be working on these projects, and incredibly lucky to be able to talk to people about the work I do. The picture of me there actually is working with aspen. I'm taking out some root shoots from roots to pot up. They're actually for the Kielderhead Wildwood project, but within Boom we do have an aspen reintroduction project running alongside this, and one of my colleagues, Ellie, may be lucky enough to come along and talk to you one day about that. So tonight I'm going to tell you a little bit of background to Boom, what the project is, who we are, what we're doing and why we're doing it. And then I'm going to move on and talk around three of the species that I'm kind of focusing on, starting with Maidenhair fern. Then we're going to talk about sundews, and lastly I'm going to be talking about green-winged orchid, and then finishing up at the very end just a little bit about how you can get involved if you wish to learn more or actually practically be involved with the project. As Tom said, it is partnership. Really important that we kind of try and work with people who have the knowledge and experience in the regions we're working in. And to that end, hosted by the University of Cumbria, working really closely with the Cumbria Wildlife Trust and Natural England. And as Tom said, also Morecambe Bay Partnership, who we're really lucky to have Michelle actually embedded within the team and really giving us that local knowledge and experience from running these kind of projects in Morecambe Bay for a long, long time. Forestry England are also really important, but probably really worth a mention there is who our funder is. So the Heritage Lottery Fund is where the majority of the money for this project comes from. And I'm sure you're aware that they fund a lot of projects similar to this and based on heritage, and really are responsible for a lot of projects in the country. So thank you to the lottery players for enabling this project to hit the ground. So what is it? At its crux, at its core, it's about working with communities. So going into communities and engaging them in conservation work. And what we're doing particularly with Boom is we're using species reintroductions as a means of sort of highlighting the work we're trying to do and what's needed in the wider conservation world. And really there's a kind of a core sort of message behind Boom. And the idea is that we're trying to create a biologically richer South Cumbria championed by communities. And so there's those two things in there, the biologically restoration, but also community driven. The team, you've already met two of us tonight. On the left-hand side there, you have Michelle Cooper, who, as I said, is Morecambe Bay Partnership, but is also seconded within the Boom team. The team project manager, Jo Sayers, there in the middle. And then around her, there's four project officers. Ellie Kent beside Michelle. And then on the right-hand side of Jo, you have Mick Mayhew, Deborah Brady, who would have heard talking about dormice a few weeks ago if you'd attended, and myself there on the very end. And I've already introduced me. So where are we working? In the Morecambe Bay area, but also going a little bit into the hinterland, also to some important habitats, which are still really important. So up into the Grisdale and Rusland Valley area there, really focusing in some of the areas around Arnside and Silverdale AONB, and the Wibberslack mosses and whip barrow. And barrow over there to the left is home to a number of our species of interest as well. And one of the other things that we're trying to do is we're actually looking in a geographic area and looking at the things that make it different in terms of its ecology, but also in terms of its sort of demographics as well, and trying to look at it as a whole and bring it all together and see if we can work on connectivity between areas rather than defining what makes them different. And that's where Morecambe Bay is really, really good at sort of bringing that together. Such a huge area with so many different communities and different habitats around it, and it gives you a wonderful opportunity to try and bring lots of people and areas together. And the real question of why now? And I think the answer to that is that it's now or never. I think everyone probably would have seen a version or heard a version of this in recent times. And it's just the idea that actually we really are in a bad place in terms of biodiversity and the loss of it. That number there is just come out this year or last year, 2020, and 68% loss in global abundance of biodiversity. And to put it onto bit more local, bring it a bit down to earth, RSPB are reporting at 1 in 5 British birds lost in the last 50 years. Mammal Society, 1 in 5 British mammals facing extinction in the coming time. So really, things like this keep on coming out. They're not new. They've been coming at us for a number of years now, but really the data's in, and it really is kind of now or never. And that's where Boom comes along. And it kind of focused by this, which I'm sure you've all heard of as well, this idea of looking at the world and looking at all the different countries and ranking them in terms of how intact they are of what should be there in terms of flora and fauna. And they've ranked them all from best to worst. And it's the UK sits all the way down here at number 189 out of 218 countries. And that really drives me in terms of why I work with Boom and why I work with the Kildahead Wildwood Project. And there's amazing people working in conservation, lots of people doing some really good work and really working really hard, but something's not quite right. And so we need to try new things, new ideas, trial things out and see what works. And Boom feels like it's really about trying something a little bit different, a little bit new, and really just, we have to try now because the things that we've been doing for years and years are clearly not working. So moving on to the species. As I said, we are a species reintroduction project. 12 species that we're actually working with, 10 of which are actual hands-on reintroductions, 2 of which are a little bit not quite reintroductions, and I'll tell you a little about them as we come to them. I'm going to go through these reasonably quickly because I really am going to focus on my species at the end there, but I just want to give you a little bit idea about what's going on. As I mentioned, we're working with aspen. Aspen populations in Cumbria have declined quite a bit over years, and what's left is kind of fragmented. Ellie Kent on the project team is working to sort of try and link up some of these fragmented areas of aspen and really sort of get this species out there in people's minds, but also in the landscape again. Really important for many different invertebrates that are endemic to aspen, but also a really interesting tree in terms of silviculture and agroforestry. The Duke of Burgundy butterfly, this is working with butterfly conservation, really in the Latter Barrow area, but really moving out from there and looking at using captive breeding techniques to extend the meta population of this butterfly in suitable habitats, really working closely with butterfly conservation there. The small blue, again, butterfly conservation, but this is more focused over in the sort of from Barrow area up to Millham, looking at all of the brownfield areas there. So this butterfly really does well in sites where kidney vetch, which is its host plant, thrives. And kidney vetch is a really good colonizing plant, and that's why these brownfield areas are covered in it, and that's why the small blue is doing really well over in some of those sites. Goldilocks aster. Goldilocks aster has the dubious accolade of being the only species that's actually probably now extinct from Cumbria. There were records right up until about 20 years ago on Humphrey Head, but no one's been able to identify a plant there in a number of years. So now it is extinct in Cumbria, but not in the UK. So we're working with populations from elsewhere in the UK to try and bring this plant back in an experimental sort of trying in different habitats and try and focus on where it can be and where it might do well, and also returning it to where it was last time with a focused idea on trying to manage the habitat to see why it was lost and what we can do to see if we can bring it back. Spiked speedwell. Sorry, jumped ahead of myself there. So spiked speedwell, very similar habitats to Goldilocks aster. However, some of the populations we have of this plant are actually doing incredibly well. On Humphrey Head, it's been spreading for a number of years now, and actually the population there is growing. So there's some really interesting things to learn there about why that plant's doing so well, and use that to help us in terms of the translocation work we do. This is actually one of the few scheduled plants on the list, so you do actually need a license to work with this, which makes it a little bit more complex. But the rewards are massive if we can understand why these plants do well and why they don't do so well. And if we do this translocation work to extend upon that knowledge base, we really stand to learn a lot. Hazel dormouse, this is a translocation that will be going on later this year. Now we are into 2021. Should have happened last year, but with everything that went on, it was delayed by 12 months. But this will be happening in the local Morecambe Bay area. I think it might be the worst kept secret where this is happening, but still not allowed to officially say. So yeah, but there's plenty of ways to find out about how you can be involved in this if you look on the Boom website. Pine marten, as I said, there's a couple of species on the list that aren't actually reintroductions. The pine marten work within Boom is a full-scale IUCN guidelines feasibility study. So this is looking at whether or not this animal needs to be helped back into the area, if it is correct for it to be brought back into the area, and if you were to bring it back into the area, how would you go about doing that? So this is an ecological, social and economic feasibility study that looks at the rights and wrongs and the practicalities of actually returning the pine marten. And this is really going to be kicking off in the area, and there's going to be lots of public consultation work alongside the ecological monitoring work required to put together that level of data. Corncrake is the second non-actual reintroduction. Corncrake work isn't a feasibility study, however. This is more about trying to understand the social and emotional ramifications of losing a species. We'll be doing work with local farmers, local communities, and talking around the idea that this animal that was here not that long ago, and very, very, very rarely and occasionally still gets heard in the Roseland Valley, is no longer here when it used to be such a ubiquitous and charismatic member of the spring and summer community, and really trying to understand what it feels like to lose those species, and then, you know, broadening the story and talking about the fact that we stand to lose so many more and we already have lost so many, and really just sort of like a counterpoint to the whole scientific getting in there, putting these animals back, also trying to understand and motivate people through that sort of emotional link to animals, whether sometimes they're not even really aware it's there. And there's a really nice piece of work come out from a local artist called Dan Fox recently, talking to local farmers and recordings of older farmers in the area around the sort of the soundscape that animals and birds sort of really important part of, and actually how parts of them are disappearing. If you want to check that out, that's on the Morecambe Bay Partnership YouTube channel. It's really worth looking at. I listened to it again today on my way up to work, and it's a wonderfully evocative piece of work there by Dan Fox. So on to my species that I'm focusing on. I'm going to start tonight on Maidenhair fern. And then when we say 12 species, it always feels a little bit of a cheat, but there are 2 sundew species that we're working. They're very closely related ecologically, so it makes sense to work on both together. And then finally, going to do a little bit, get people caught up on where we are with green-winged orchid. It was by far the busiest species we had for me this year, and some really exciting things happened. So I've got a reasonable amount of time at the end there just to let you know what's been happening with green-winged orchid work this year. So as I said, partnership working, all the different species necessitate slightly different partners and different organizations and groups coming in. With this particular species I'm going to talk about now, working really closely with the Arnside and Silverdale AONB, National Trust, and the Teratological Society as well, which probably gives you a clue as to what I'm about to talk about. Maidenhair fern, Adiantum capillus veneris. Really, really beautiful, delicate plant. This 12 to 13 centimeters, I think, is kind of an average sort of clump size, but really if you get the right habitat and you get the right sort of moisture and shelter, you get much bigger than 30 centimeters. Some of the ones I'm looking at in the area are far closer to 2-3 foot across in total. And these delicate pale green leaves are really sort of a really important factor of it, because they will give it that really distinct and light feeling. Many ferns are quite hard and quite sort of tough, whereas these ones really quite delicate. And I'm pretty sure that sort of is why it's kind of led to some of its problems. What's its habitat? So as you can see, it really likes cliff faces. It's not just natural cliffs, it will quite happily colonize quarries and also pavements too. So it's quite happy to be on horizontal surfaces. And even if you get a wet enough, dark enough, sheltered enough wall, it will actually cultivate the mortar within those walls as well. But it is a typically lowland species. It really doesn't like too extreme, doesn't like to be covered in frost for much of the year. It can get through a little bit of frost and a little bit of snow cover in winter, but really likes it to be fairly mild. That gives you a clue as to where you'll find it throughout the UK. So on the left-hand side here, we've got a distribution map, which is showing all of the records for the Maidenhair fern since the turn of the last century. So really from 1900 up until now. And as you can see, fairly sporadic, but fairly well covered through England and just into Scotland there, but not really anywhere that's that distinct, apart from maybe down southwest there. Quite interestingly, if you look at the map on the right, this is its distribution now. So these are all records since 2000, and actually there's not much change there. So be forgiven for thinking there's nothing really the problem here. There's not really any decline. However, these records go from 1900, and in terms of Maidenhair fern, sorry, just to say that it really is the same story in Morecambe Bay area there, same distribution, the same populations since 1900 to modern day. But yeah, the problem was that the real decline in this species happened way before 1900. It happened during the sort of 1800s, 1870s, 1880s. Was a real height of Victorian fern collecting. A real fad came in, a real interest in these plants, and it became very fashionable to have them displayed around your house in quite ornate ways. And this led to actually some of our ferns being really heavily collected by amateurs, but also by people keen to make money by selling them on. And that really had a big effect on particularly the more accessible populations that there are. So that was the main problem, and that's why we sort of got to the 1900s, and the fashion kind of disappeared, but the ferns never really recovered in some cases. One of the other problems that you're likely seeing now is scrub incursion. Now this is down in Arnside. This is an old quarry down there, just on the just south of the Coast Guard station. This little quarry here has just been left, and it's kind of grown out. And as you can see, you've got these ash trees and a few other scrub species coming up there, and you can see the bramble and stuff coming in as well. And it's not so much that it doesn't like the shade. I think it can do okay in the shade, and it quite likes the shelter. But the problem you have is the deposition of organic material on the surfaces that it would normally inhabit. So normally it will inhabit the wet, tufa rich, the limestone seepings coming out of the wall. But these are really good for leaves and other litter to collect on, and these will turn into soil. And as soon as you've got anything approximating a soil, you'll start getting grasses and other real colonizer species coming in, and the fern really can't hold its own against these. They will just cover it out. And then this is what we're seeing in a lot of places where the old quarries aren't used anymore. We are no longer sort of keeping our hedgerows down, and maybe the woodland management is the same as was. So scrub is really taking over, and that's a problem for this species as well. And then of course there's the ever-present climate change issue. I'm not going to pretend that I understand what the impact of climate change is on this species, but it seems likely that with changing rainfall patterns throughout a year, really dry springs going into potentially really, really over wet summers and late autumns, that maybe you're losing some of the year-round reliable, damp but not waterlogged cliff faces. And so that would have an impact on this fern as well. So within Boom, what are our aims? I've tried to kind of quantify all of our aims for all the species into 4 key aims. And the main one with Maidenhair fern is trying to understand how much of it there is. It's fairly well recorded because there's not too much of it, and there's actually been a reasonable amount of work going on in it, but it's all kind of, we know where they are, but we don't know how much there is. So I've started doing a little bit of work on trying to understand exactly how much there is, how much of the plant there is at these different populations, and trying to get a bit of year-on-year data analysis going on so we can understand whether they're stable, decreasing or increasing. I'm really lucky to be building on the work done by a local group over in the Arnside and Silverdale AOMB, led by a lady called Anne Kitchen, who really sort of pushed ahead with reintroducing this plant a number of years ago and actually wrote a project to do this. And so we're really kind of building upon that work, taking what she's done and trying to expand it. Really keen to identify new translocation sites as well. It's not so easy. Sometimes if you're putting in something that goes into woodland or grasslands, we kind of know where the woodlands and grasslands are, but we're really looking for sort of very specific niche habitats here. And these ones could exist at the bottom of people's gardens or really inaccessible parts of little woodland. So we're really looking for some local knowledge about where these limestone, wet, sheltered cliff faces are to help us find where we can put these. And then to develop the knowledge and enthusiasm within the community to continue the propagation and translocation. All 4 of those, like I said, are really working on continuing the work done by this lady, Anne Kitchen, who designed and implemented her own reintroduction project with the help of some other botanists over in the Arnside area. She actually propagated the plants, come up with a methodology of how to keep them stored in an area that kept them nice and moist, misting them every day, reintroduce them to sites in the Arnside area at with the permission of landowners. There were some challenges, however, with the work that Anne did, and one of the sites that they did relocate to, they did actually have some loss of the plants. They did really well, took really well, and then overnight they disappeared. So we really want to understand why that was. Maybe it was someone still collecting them, or maybe it was someone who disagrees with the idea of putting plants in. So we're going to do a lot of engagement work in trying to communicate with the community what we're doing, what Anne was trying to do, and maybe sort of open that conversation as to why that might have happened. Boom, we actually have got hold of a little plant that was in danger of being swamped last year. It was given to me by Anne, and I put it in a jam jar. It very quickly grew too big for the jam jar, so I repurposed this biscuit jar here on the left-hand side. And actually, during the summertime, there was spores on the leaves. I wasn't sure if anything had happened, but later on in the year, all of these little bits, you can't see them too well, but down the bottom of the jar here, these are all the spores, have actually developed, germinated through prothalli, and come up into little maidenhair fern plants. And this is really, really promising, gives us really, makes it very straightforward in terms of actually propagating plants. If some of these, even a fraction of these grow into mature plants, we'll be able to separate them off, put them on their own bit of toother, grow them on, and we've got a real head start in terms of developing the plants that we'll need to put into areas as soon as we have identified the areas that we need to put them into. I said a little bit before about the mapping. At the moment, most of the populations are well known by Anne and a number of people, but there's nothing actually written down in terms of their size. So I've been doing a little bit of work photographing them and then using a bit of software to draw around them, using a scale bar here, which is 1 meter. You can get a calibrated polygon that you can draw around it, and that gives an area. And I'll do that on the cliff where all the little patches of maidenhair fern are, and I'll build up an area. And then next year we'll do the same. The following year we'll do the same, and then we'll be able to tell by whether those areas are going up, going down, staying the same, or just fluctuating, how these populations are doing, and use that to also help us inform what we're looking for in terms of potential relocation sites. Yeah, so what's to come? Continue to communicate with the population, the local population and community, try to, sort of really spread the message of why we're working with the Maidenhair Fern, but where that fits into the wider boom work. Identify local sites to put these in, to recruit propagation volunteers and ambassadors. Now, you hear this term a couple of times tonight. Species ambassadors. These are people who, if we identify them or they come forward and say they're really interested in specific boom species, really investing in them and developing their skills and knowledge, so that when boom comes to an end, which it has to come to an end, the funding does end, that isn't necessarily the end of the translocation work with these or other related species. If we can invest in training up individuals now who are really interested, then they can potentially take this project beyond the boom's lifetime, and a real genuine legacy there. And then obviously translocate the actual plants. So that's it for Maidenhair Fern. Going to move on to the next species now. This one has a slightly different range of partners, very similar again. One of the ones that's really key in this, and a little bit some of you might not have heard of, is the Northwest Rare Plants Initiative. Now, they're an organisation based down in Lancaster, a bit south, sort of Lancashire area. They've been doing lots of work, conservation, translocations as well. But they've also done a lot of work recently on these. So sundews. This is oblong-leaved, so Drosera intermedia. And this one is great sundew, Drosera anglica, also known as English sundew. Very, very similar. Really, to tell the difference, you need to be kind of seeing them side by side. This one does have slightly less elongated leaves, but they can be a real sort of range between the shape of the leaves. The key difference between the two is just the size difference. Great sundew is by far the bigger of the two, and really the biggest one that you see in the British Isles. We have 3 Drosera species in the British Isles: great sundew, oblong leaf sundew, and round leaf sundew. Round leaf sundew is really quite abundant, and one you're by far most likely to see if you walk in suitable habitats. So what to look out for? Rosette forming, so really distinct sort of circular leaf form coming out from a very central point, up to 10 centimeters tall for intermedia, which is oblong leaved, or up to 15 centimetres tall with Anglica or great sundew. They do flower, and they've got beautiful little flowers, and they come out from June and they persist for quite a long time, all the way through to August. And their flower spikes actually extend quite a bit above the plant. So it's quite common, or possible rather, with round leaf sundew in particular, to see the flowers and not actually realize they come from this fairly diminutive plant down the bottom. They look quite different from it, and you'll see flowers in a second. And they're insectivorous. I think that's a really important part of their behavior. As you can see in that picture there, they do actually get an awful lot of their nutrients from predating upon insects. So these are the flowers I was talking about. I included these flowers because so often with sundew, it's the beautiful red sort of dew covered leaves that get the attention, but I think the flowers are absolutely gorgeous. The left-hand side one there is Drosera intermedia, and the two on the right are Drosera anglica. So right-hand side is great sundew, left-hand side is oblong leaf sundew. And there's really not much difference between the two of them. But as you can see, nice long flower spike extending above the leaves. It's not actually as far above the leaves as it would be with round leaf. It's a very sensible arrangement to have, really, because the flower is how they pollinate, and they need insects to pollinate them. So what they're doing is basically keeping their insect pollinating part well away from their insect devouring part. And they do that quite effectively, like I say. So they're insectivorous, and that allows them to survive in these nutrient poor areas. You'll find them calcareous mires, so mires with a little bit of sort of calcium present, blanket bogs, sphagnum bogs, basically anywhere where there is found to be nutrient deficiency. They really aren't a very robust plant. So the fact that they can get some of their nutrients from insects means they can go into these areas where nothing else is really able to grow, and they can find their niche there. And they really will be found on sort of like the edge of pools in the really wet, waterlogged areas that nothing else can really survive too well in. And they've done amazingly well at this. They really like a bit of disturbed land. They'll be one of the first plants to cultivate those areas after you have a little bit of disturbance, either from grazing or peat restoration work. You'll also find them on peaty grasslands if there's, like I say, nutrient poor enough. But really these days, when we want to find them, we're looking for raised bogs, mires, and the map kind of bears that out. If you look here at the distribution of oblong-leaved sundew, really up in the flow country, the west coast of Scotland, out on the islands there, and then following some of the west coast, the really wetter side of England, on the peatlands. A few down there on the south coast, they'll be in the heathlands around Dorset heathlands. There's still some of the protected heaths down there. You'll still find some of these species. And there on the right hand side, you can see it hasn't changed too much. Same distribution, but far fewer actual records since 2000. So you can see that it is an ongoing decline for these. And in the local area, you can see it's a very similar story. You used to be found since the turn of the century. You could easily find them pretty much anywhere in the uplands where you had mires, and then down in the Witherslack mosses here where you had the lowland bogs. That really has just become the lowland bogs area around Witherslack on the right-hand side there, and some of the protected bogs in National Trust land and Cumbria Wildlife Trust land in the uplands there. Very, very similar story for Anglica, although very much much more predominant in North Scotland, and a few populations through England and in Ireland and Northern Ireland there. And again, very similar story in terms of local story, turn of the last century, could be found in most of the suitable habitats, but as those habitats have become depleted over the years, you really are only finding them now on the most intact or the best restored areas. So what are the threats? I've talked a lot about the nutrient poor requirements. There's a lot of nutrient enrichment these days for different causes. That has a problem, and that brings in grasses, which will just outcompete them, and other forbs and herbs that will outcompete them. But there's a lot of work went on in the middle of the last century to drain our peatlands to make them potentially or ideally better for agriculture. They were mixed success in terms of agriculture, but very effective at drying and degrading the quality of these bogs. And that was a real problem for a lot of very, very specialist species, including the Drosera or sundew. Planting of trees as well. There were trees planted, particularly down the Witherslack. There was a lot of pine planted across site. That further dries, but it also ends up nutrient enrichment as the leaf litter comes down. All afforestation isn't deliberate. When you do dry the bogs out, you will get natural succession of birch and alder moving into the slightly more habitable, drier ground. And that all really spelt bad news for Drosera and Sundew, alongside a number of other really specialist bog species. The bar at the bottom there is the IUCN Red List status for these plants, and that is actually global status, and they are near threatened on a global scale. And that kind of really reflects the fact that peatlands are threatened on a global scale. Peat extraction continues in this country, even under some fairly strict regulations, but those regulations are far laxer in other parts of the world. And so peat extraction continues, and burning, grazing, drainage continues, and the planting of trees on bogs continues as well. So yeah, near threatened on a global scale, but also near threatened locally. In terms of the aims, very similar to the Maidenhair fern again. We really are just trying to increase the abundance of these species across the project area. Really lucky to be working with Cumbria Wildlife Trust, who've done a whole lot of work over the last 20, 30 years to restore the Witherslack mosses, re-wet them, which means that we're ready to sort of move back in and translocate these plants there. They really won't do it on their own because they're poor colonizers. They will slowly move out from a central area at sort of like a metre a year, but they won't jump across rows, and they'll really struggle to go from one hill to another hill. So once these habitats have been restored, we need to give them a helping hand to get back in. We want to extend beyond the Witherslack mosses. We know Cumbria Wildlife Trust, we also know National Trust and National Park have all been doing work on peatland restoration. So we want to talk to these organisations as well and look at finding out about the areas that they've been working on, see what state they are, see how the habitat has been restored, what the ongoing management is, and really extend this. There is no reason why, with the amount of peatland restoration work that's going on, that we could probably not restore these plants to something approximating their traditional distribution across South Cumbria and up into the fells. It's a really, really, really straightforward plant to propagate, and we're really going to take advantage of that and try to kind of engage with communities and really sort of almost farm out the propagation of these plants. Very minimal amount of effort, equipment, and attention required to generate a large number of plants. And so we'll be trying to work with communities and groups who might not traditionally think they have the access or knowledge to do this. And it feels like it'd be a really good species to get people into the idea of, you know, it doesn't take much, just a little bit of encouragement and a little bit of support, and you too could be taking part in meaningful conservation work. And to that end, it's all about developing the skills and the knowledge within these communities to hopefully take this and continue with it beyond the lifetime of Boom, because we are only 4 years at the moment. If we do get extended, brilliant, but the chances are we might not, and so we really want the work to continue. And as you'll find out with my next species, 4 years isn't really long enough to do the work that you need to do. Some of these plants take a lot longer to grow. Sundew isn't one of them, luckily. You can grow multiple crops almost in a year, but Maidenhair fern and the orchid are by far more complex and time-demanding plants. So what have we done so far? We're working with National Trust to harvest these plants. There's a mire on the top of Clafe Heights called Nor Moss, which has both of these plants in really, really good, healthy numbers. And that's thanks to a lot of work that the National Trust have been doing on removing trees and keeping drains blocked, so that moss and that bog stays nice and wet. And because of the work they're doing, because they're taking the trees, they're disturbing land. So that's really good for the sundew. So they've got lots and lots of great and oblong leaf sundew up there, and we would like to use them as donor populations. With working with National Trust, they really careful, and rightly so, to sort of ask the right questions in terms of what you're doing, how you're doing it, how you know this isn't going to be detrimental to existing habitats and species in that. And so they have a body called the National Trust Natural Environment Advisory Board, who we have put a proposal together, submitted it to them. They're going to go over it. We've actually just submitted this week they'll carefully go over it, make recommendations and say, yes, you can, or no, you can't, without making these changes. And that's really important because it actually enables us to put down a really solid methodology that's public. Anyone can look at this document and see that's what we're doing, that's how we're doing it, and comment on it. And it's a really good effort for us, but it's really good for National Trust to maintain control of their sites that they've done a lot of work on. I'm going to tell you what else I've been doing. I couldn't get out on site this year due to COVID to actually get any great or oblong leaved. So I decided to go and get some round leaf sundew. As I said, far more abundant. This is growing all over the place, Northumberland, Cumbria. So I went across to Butterburn Flow, which is in the north of Cumbria, on the border with Northumberland on the River Irthing, and collected some round leaf sundew and trialed the propagation techniques. With pretty good success, to be fair. Never having done this before, I spoke to Northwest Rare Plants Initiative, who are doing work with Lancashire Wildlife Trust. He wrote an A4 piece of paper with instructions on, and I followed that. And these were the instructions. And it was basically, find your sundew, that's it there in its natural habitat. Really quite diminutive, as you can see, but quite prolific. When it likes a place, it likes a place, and it can almost blanket and carpet it. So I collected a small number, as you can see, put them in my own little artificial bog there, which is a little bit of peat taken from a side of a pool, a little bit of Sphagnum cuspidatum, which is a really wet, it's called, like really wet, can't remember, it's got a name like wet cat moss or something, but cuspidatum is the Latin name. But really nice one because it doesn't grow tall, it's kind of decumbent, but it gives the sundew a little bit of shelter there. So this is just another picture of the flowers, just to show you how much they do extend past the leaves. But after I'd left these plants in my artificial bog for a little while, they really started enjoying it and they were happy, and they set flower, which is a really good sign, and also started developing new leaves. Once they started developing the new leaves, I took the new growth and I cut it off, and you really straightforwardly put it in a little container of deionized water. This is just a clear Tupperware container, deionized water in it, the leaves clipped, dropped in, the lid put on, and you leave it for a number of weeks. I left these for 3 weeks, and after 3 weeks, this happens. Really, as you can see there, 5-6 leaf cuttings in there, and each one has developed a perfect replica clone of itself growing out of the lamina of the leaf. And that was after 5 weeks. It was really that simple. Once they get to a certain size, so you can actually see distinctively the leaves of the plantlet, it's time to remove them. You take them out and you simply embed them again into your peat mixture. One of the things I didn't say is really important to use deionized water with this. Tap water really isn't any good. You need a really low iron content, and to that end I was using deionized, but also monitoring it with a iron device, which have to keep it below a certain level of microsiemens to ensure that there's not too many minerals in there. And that was it, really straightforward, and they grew. Unfortunately, I wasn't particularly careful in the late autumn rains, and my little fake bog flooded and they became inundated. I do not know if they will return, whether they had formed their sort of hibernaculum, which is what they regress to a dormant state during winter. But if they haven't, I'm going to leave it and see if any of the seeds that would have dropped out of those flowers take over the coming spring. So I'm really interested to see how that works as well, because we will do a little bit of work on seed collection. Also went down to visit Lancashire Wildlife Trust. Now they, like I said, are working with the Northwest Rare Plants Initiative, and they've got some absolutely incredible peatland restoration sites down there, and they're doing some absolutely brilliant work, and really important in a short project to reach out to local, regional, national organizations doing similar and work that you're interested in, and trying to learn from them and not try and rewrite the methodology. And we went down there and spent a day down there with a guy called Mike, who's been doing some work on not just translocation of sundew, which is the bottom picture there, that's some oblong leaf sundew, which they have put into Risley moss, I think. But also they've got some big peat extraction sites, which the Lancashire Wildlife Trust have taken ownership of. And they're doing some really interesting work on not just restoring the vegetation to them, but also looking at the idea of farming peatland species to aid further peatland restoration work around the region, but also around the nation. And they're really looking at different methodologies, working with local universities to trial different techniques. And there's some really, really interesting stuff they're doing there. And that right-hand picture there is a bog in a box, which is one of their engagement ideas, which is fantastic idea. Go to a school, give them all the little species, little cuttings and seeds that you'd find on a bog, and then leave it, watch them grow. And when you've got that, you've got a perfect functioning bog in a box. And it's a wonderful thing. Really works well with kind of like making that idea about restoration as something that is active and people can be involved on at any scale. To come in 2021, the sites we're working on, we're going to have to try and understand the current situation with these species in terms of their abundance, but also in terms of other species and indicators of their health. So we'll be doing some survey work to find these plants, but also what else is there, and also from where we're taking them from to have an idea of the abundance there, so that in future years we can go back and show that we're not actually deteriorating the quality of these areas. Really keen to do a lot of training within this, training in the propagation. The Northwest Rare Plants Initiative will be coming up to pass on their experience that they've learned from propagating these plants. Surveying, so how we actually do it, what surveying skills you'd be required to survey these vast flat areas, but also the ID skills required to identify the plants and successfully identify the plants that we are using as indicator species. And then we move on to the propagation, again, working with communities, but also working closely with students on this, setting up a fake bog at University of Cumbria, something that students can come in on a year-on-year basis and be involved in propagating, but also do some projects on and try and get some interesting data on the best propagation technique to maximize yields. And also the best way to try and understand all of the habitats we're working on is actually get out on them and spend some time learning about them actually in the field. So once we are all allowed again to go back out, really planning on doing some walks and talks across these habitats, grasslands, bogs, wetlands, farmlands as well. And then finally on to green-winged orchid. Again, this familiar list of partners there, but a new one up the top there, the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew, really heavily involved in the work we're doing on the green-winged orchid. And I'll explain why they are involved and the work they're doing in short time. So green-winged orchid, Anacanthus moreo. It's a short orchid, 7 to 30 centimeters. These pictures were taken on the lot in Silverdale. There were one or two that were larger than 30 centimeters, but by far the norm was really in that sort of 10 to 20 centimeter range. And they flower in late spring, so a relatively early flowering orchid, but they flower in late spring. That is actually creeping a little bit earlier now than it used to, but they're still still coming out late spring. Pink to purple flowers, and occasionally white. And down in Silverdale, I did see all three of these different colours as well, which is really nice. Distinct green veins on the flowers, where the name comes from, the green-winged orchid. The Latin name, Anacanthus moreo. Moreo is, I think, Latin for clown, if I remember my own mini quiz that I did earlier on this year. And I think that's to give the idea of this sort of like real sort of like jester type appearance, these distinctive stripes. And those stripes will persist right over till the flower going over and the seeds developing. So it's really nice, useful identification aid looking for those stripes. Thin pointed leaves, and when they're young and healthy, there should be no spots on them. Their habitat is unimproved grasslands, and coastal grasslands in particular is where I've encountered them recently. So the population at the lots, but there's also populations at Latterbarrow, and they have been identified over the years on and off at Jack Scout as well. But pasture as well, they're known to be favourable towards, but also open woodland. I've not identified them here, but I can imagine, good, nice, complex open woodland, and they'd be happy enough to survive there. The story of Anacanthus moreo, or green-winged orchid, in terms of distribution over the past 120 years. On the left-hand side there, you can see there's a real sort of centering of the population in central, southern areas and southeast, with these fingers going up the west coast through Wales into the Morecambe Bay area, and then up the east coast up into Northumberland, just there. Really not much north of there, a little bit of a population in Ayrshire. The right-hand side, record since 2020, really you can see that the distribution hasn't changed too much, but the actual abundance within, like the number of records within that range, rather, the distribution has declined, the range has stayed much the same. And that's kind of mirrored by what you can see in the insets there. I'm sorry, they're a little bit small, but you can see that in the Morecambe Bay area, records all the way around the coastal grasslands, but now really sort of centered on the ones we know around Arnside and Silverdale, and some there around the Grange area. So why is that? Again, it's a story of agricultural improvement. One of the really important things about orchid is their mycorrhizal symbiosis. Now, 90% of all plants on Earth form some kind of symbiosis with fungi to survive. It's really, really, really important for orchid. Their seed are microscopic, really tiny, and they have no energy source within their seeds. And they won't actually germinate unless they actually form a symbiotic relationship with a suitable fungus in the soil. And that's really by chance. They set out thousands of seed, and if they come across the right fungus, they will germinate. If they don't, there's no chance of them doing it because they have no energy stores. Agricultural improvement over the years has kind of had a two-pronged attack on orchids. The deposition of fertilizer over the years has meant that many soil biota, particularly fungus, has been affected by these. Phosphorus isn't particularly good for fungus, and it can really have detrimental effect on it. The fewer fungus present in the soil, the less chance the seed has of actually encountering one and germinating. So that's one of the problems. Intensification as well, just cutting, grazing, stronger, shorter, and these plants won't survive that. They need a bit of protection, but not too much. Changing practices and guidelines is a bit more complex. It is possible with the best intentions to not really support green-winged orchid when you're doing really well to support other meadow and pasture flowers. Its early flowering nature and its shortness means that if you do change the grazing regime to allow a slightly longer sward, so cutting a little bit later, it can mean that this plant actually gets swamped out. And there's a few hypotheses that that might be what's happening at Humphrey Head, where the populations have declined in recent years in spite of grazing regimes aimed at helping the flora over there. So just sometimes that changing to help one thing can have a detrimental effect on another, and that might be what we're seeing here. Climate change, I think, is a really, really clear and present effect on this particular species. The picture on the right-hand side there is of the lots. As you can see, you've got a bank there which has traditionally been absolutely inundated with green-winged orchid, continuing all the way down into that lusher green bit at the bottom. Now, this move towards drier springs and sort of wetter summers has meant that at a time when they're coming through and they're trying to flower and they're trying to take all their energy they can and put it into seed production, they're actually being stressed by drought on these thin soils. And that means that they're going over quicker, they're not creating as many seeds, and they're just not doing as well. And actually what we found this year is that there were very few plants got to maturity on that dry bank. And the ones that survived were down in that lusher area down the bottom there, which then had a later problem of that lusher area growing much taller than the surrounding area and swamping them out. So that change in sort of wet springs into nice mild summers to dry springs and really wet summers is potentially having an effect on sort of these plants in their preferred habitat. We are seeing the populations at a lot stable and increasing, but that's the only one in the area, and possibly nationally. All the other populations are really in decline. Within the green-winged orchid, then there are the same 4 aims, slightly reworded: reintroduce and reinforce to sites of suitable habitat and ongoing management in the Morecambe Bay area. So there are a few sites we know. Again, Cumbria Wildlife Trust and National Trust really keen to work with us, but we're looking to work with wider organisations and landowners if we can. But it's really important that we understand that ongoing management. We can't just put these anywhere. They're quite a lot of effort going in to get these plants going. So we want to understand what is going to be the future of these habitats we put them in. They might be good now, but with the uncertainty around what comes after countryside stewardship, you know, we don't know what they're going to be. So really working with landowners to get assurances of what their plans are. We need to work with Kew to establish a thorough understanding of the ecological requirements for effective propagation. I'm going to talk about that in the next couple of slides. The mycorrhiza stuff I talked about earlier on is really important, and that's where Kew have come on board, and they've been doing some really good work this year. working with local communities again. We want to monitor these plants. We need to know how they're doing when we put them in. So we want to sort of train local members of the community up to recognise and monitor these plants. And then again, this idea of a species ambassador. So identifying individuals are really keen to take this a step further, learn the skills, receive training, maybe go visit other sites and sort of take this on to the next step after boom. So far, again, working with National Trust, the lots and Jack Scout are National Trust land, so we have to work with their National Environment Advisory Board. That went in last year, and we have approval now with some really useful suggestions and offers of help from that advisory board. This year, we had a whole host of things that we needed to do, collecting seed, collecting root cuttings, soil sampling. Q are going to come up and spend some time here. It was all absolutely scuppered by coronavirus restrictions, as you can imagine. So we were quite worried because really specific times you need to take these seed and really specific methods to take the root cuttings. Really concerned that we were going to be put back 12 months on what is quite a tight timescale anyway for orchid. But we were incredibly lucky to have a really local, dedicated volunteer, really knowledgeable local volunteer called Julia Sire, who was able to take in the lots as part of her daily exercise over lockdown. And she kept an eye on these plants as they were maturing and let me know how they were doing. And then I was able to forward that on to Q, who were observing, and then at a moment's notice just said, right, okay, I think we need you to get some seed. So again, Julia Sire was able to get onto site, spend some time with some instructions from Q and a little bit of guidance from me, collecting seed over a period of weeks to collect immature, maturing and mature seed over a number of weeks and send these down to Q, which we did. When it became apparent that Q weren't going to be allowed to travel, it also fell to me and Julia to actually extract the root material, which was quite daunting, the idea of the plants had gone over by this time, so we had to actually mark them with stakes because we were going to be getting them up from underground. So we were going to be extracting them from soil and trying to extract the soil and the root from the soil. But kind of decided that I probably wasn't qualified enough to do that. So we came up with the idea of soil cores, where we took the whole lump of soil and sent all of it down to Q. So they now have their soil samples as well. But they were able to extract the plants from within those soil cores to do the work they needed to do, which is where I'm going to pass. Well, I'm going to continue talking to you, but I'm going to move over to what Q have been doing this year. And this is probably some of the most important scientific work that we're doing on the orchids. And it's all kind of happened this summer, thanks in huge part to Julia Sire being able to keep an eye on those plants and getting that material for us. So there's two prongs that Q are doing within the green-winged orchid propagation program. They are working with immature seed and mature seed. So with the immature seed, I said previously that seed from orchids will not germinate unless it is in the presence of mycorrhiza. That's not actually the case if you get immature seed from green capsules. You can actually germinate them on artificial media. So that is what they did. They took the immature seed from the earlier seed pods we sent down, they extracted the seed and they put it on agar. And as you can see, they germinate. These are two different plants here. The middle picture, you can see a germinated seed beside a non-germinated seed. And on the right-hand side, you can see a whole bundle of germinated seeds. From the seed pods we sent down, they had quite variable germination rates, 0% from some plants and 60% from one plant in particular. So a real variation probably in the viability and the health of the plants we sent down, possibly due to ongoing stresses from climate change or just regional or daily or year-on-year fluctuations in population status. But we have germinated around 300 seeds and we're moving to try and get them off agar onto actual organic material soon. We haven't actually successfully done any yet, but there is soon that will be happening. The second stage, the second phase or second string of work we're doing with Q is with mature seed. So this is the mature seed that requires mycorrhizal symbiosis. This obviously can't happen in a lab unless they have the fungi that actually makes this happen. And that's why we had to send down the root material. The mycorrhiza are the part of the fungus that go out and they sort of explore the soil and they find their way into other plants and all the nooks and crannies and all the minerals and break them down. And so the mycorrhiza within a plant will tend to be really focused within that root structure of the plant, hence the importance of getting healthy root down to them. As you can see, they were able to extract the plant from the soil core. That's the picture number 2 there. These are the roots coming off here that they wanted to do the work on. Picture 3 is a section across one of those roots. And I've been assured that in the top left-hand corner, that discoloration, the sort of browny orange color, that is the fungal mycorrhiza within the actual structure of the root there. And that's what they were looking for. They were able to find that in a number of different roots, and they were able to extract that, culture that again in vitro to increase the amount of it. And then once they have the cultured fungus, they're able then to pass that into contact with the mature seed at this point. And then just last week, I received the pictures on the right-hand side. Now, these are germinated seedlings of green-winged orchid from the mature seed we sent down this year, germinated in the presence of fungus, cultured from the roots of the plant we sent down. And that whole process happened in just 8 weeks. And that's how effective and efficient that relationship between orchid and fungus is. Once you get the right mycorrhiza in contact with the right seed, it really does move quite quickly. So at the moment, we're at about 130 seedlings. They are more growing all the time. So there is strong potential that we are going to end up with a good few hundred seedlings from this year, in spite of some real setbacks with COVID. So that's really, really, really exciting. We do hope to potentially create or germinate over 1,000 seeds within Boom. The idea being that we can move across the county, experimenting with some, putting some in sites that might not have had them in records in before, but now appear to be the right management, putting them in other sites that we know are the right management, and really experiment with different sort of numbers in different areas and try and learn, is this an effective way of trying to reintroduce this species? We may also do some work with seed spreading as well as a way of identifying the suitable areas within larger areas. So really, it's an experimentation, but off the back of some really important scientific work done by Kew Gardens. I can strongly recommend watching this webinar that was put out just before Christmas. It was myself, Natural England, National Trust, and Dr. Vishwambaran Sarasan from Kew Gardens, who's doing the work for us. And he gave a talk which explained the work that he's doing with our green-winged orchid, but also internationally on a number of different orchid species. And he explained the science so much better than me, with a lot of incredible images of the work he's done in Madagascar and across the UK. So if you want to, you can find that on the Morecambe Bay website, Morecambe Bay Partnership YouTube site, sorry. Really worth if you've got a couple of hours or an hour to spare to check out Sarasan's talk there on the work you are doing. So what's to come? I kind of hinted there that we're going to carry on trying to identify sites, and that's really working with Cumbria Wildlife Trust, Arnside and Silverdale AONB Trust, who we've already had a reasonable amount of contact with, but other landowners as well, who are managing their land in ways that they think make it suitable for biodiversity and bringing wildflowers back. We need to survey the green-winged orchid populations we already have to understand how they're doing. So we'll be assisting the organisations or the landowners there in sort of offering resource to help survey those areas. But we'll also be looking to find some additional donor sites. We know about some populations on Cumbria Wildlife Trust land, but we'd also be interested in populations elsewhere that we're not so familiar with, and trying to understand what's enabling them to do well, but also potentially using them as seed source for further propagation work with Kew. We want to extend how our knowledge of recipient sites, so talking to landowners again to identify where we can put these plants in. We have to continue liaising with Kew, so that means collecting more seed, potentially more root material from some of the other populations this year. So a real repeat of what happened last year, but hopefully with a bit more ability to engage with a wider range of people and volunteers. We will be receiving seedlings back from Kew at some point, and they are going to be in a very safe state. So they'll be mature enough to come away from Kew, but they won't be mature enough to be planted out. So these are going to have to be looked after for possibly a number of years. That looking after will be done under the stewardship of Boom to start with some training from Q and other local orchid experts in how to look after them. But we'll be looking to the community to do that for us. There is potentially going to be hundreds of plants that need looking after. And we'd really like people with an interest in the project to get involved and take some of these plants on and look after them for a number of years that they are comfortable with, or a number of months if they're more comfortable with that. But really, again, about trying to get involvement more spread out, more diverse, and trying to get people engaged and offer training to the ability to do it. And then at the end, they're collecting more seed. And again, the idea of doing these walks, actually getting out into these sites, looking at the areas we're collecting from and talking about why these areas are special, why they're good, why they could be better, and what we can do to try and help that. And that's it for my species. Just finally, a slide here if you want to learn a bit more about what Boom is doing. There's a number of different ways of contacting us there via social media, but feel free to contact me directly if any questions or any queries around any of the species I talked about. And that's got nothing to do with my species. That's a beautiful pale tussock moth there that we found in gate barrows. It's just a great picture, so I like putting it up.
Right, thank you very much, Stephen. Fantastic. We do have a lot of questions, some quite specific ones, some kind of local knowledge type questions, but just to start off, because we have had there's clearly a few people who have joined today who are really interested in helping. So I don't know if either you or Michelle wants to come in, but can you be a little bit more specific, I guess, about how people can get involved? Is it as simple as just emailing people at the end of this talk and then you'll give more information? Because there's clearly, there's the 3 different species, but some very specific things you're asking people to do, isn't there? Whether it's, growing on sundews or, taking on, looking after the seedlings of the greenwood orchids or what have you. So can you say just a little bit more about how people get involved?
Yeah, it probably is best I hand over to Michelle at this point, because Michelle will be the one who'll be managing the volunteers. So
yeah, sure. That I'm just putting up another slide. I can do 2 things at once. There we go. So that just has the same contacts that Stephen had for the project, or also you can just go to the Morecambe Bay Partnership website and click on the Get Involved section, and that'll take you through to our volunteer pages. And it's as simple as that, really. Just drop us an email, we'll send you a form and we can let you know. There's different opportunities related to all the different species. So it might be out taking root cuttings for the aspen. It might be some of the things that Stephen's talked about growing at home. You might want to get just involved in terms of coming along to events, or if we're able to get them up and running, guided walks and so on. And there's also a lot of training opportunities too, with some really fantastic training providers. So a really great chance to learn new skills. And as Stephen says, it's key really that people are connected to these species in the long term. And if people want to have, good quality engagement over a number of years, that would be perfect for the project, particularly if you live locally and can kind of really lend a hand on a regular basis. That gives those species the fighting chance really for the long term and after Boom comes to an end. There's lots of cultural activities going to be going on as well, art classes and talks and all kinds of different community projects, annual events, lots of stuff to get involved with. But those are the core contacts, and we'd be happy to fill people in with more, depending on what species they're interested in, or if they want to get involved with plants, with Stephen's work, and put them in touch with Stephen directly. Thank
you, Michelle. I mean, it does strike me as being quite an ideal lockdown project, some of this stuff. I mean, I appreciate in the summer, once people have had vaccinations and things, it'll start changing a little bit. But becoming a propagation volunteer in particular is an ideal thing to be doing from home. Yeah. And there is already growing cowslips and things like that for the butterflies. They were doing that last year, and then we did have a little window where we could plant them out with some volunteers before Christmas, which was great. So lots of things people could do from home. Yeah, and then moving on to actually translocating the plants and I said becoming ambassadors and things like that. And there's something lovely. I think particularly the one that got my attention was the Maidenhair fern, and the idea that they were sort of driven to the brink of extinction by fern collectors, which I mean is coming from a place of love, isn't it, really? but just sort of slightly misguided, and now maybe we can harness that same kind of interest in these beautiful little plants to bring them back from extinction. There's a nice sort of coming full circle, isn't there, I think? Right, so we'll come down to the questions. I've divided them up by species because they seem to break down that way. Yeah, the first one I think is quite an interesting one from Nigel. And I'm going to just expand this question very slightly. So what is interesting, I think, is that as people involved in nature conservation, we've done quite a lot of work, I think, talking about the importance of scruffiness and the importance of scrub, and, kind of almost running campaigns to get people to appreciate scrub. And now you're coming along and telling us that actually scrub's bad, and, this grass is far too long, and these cliffs, we've just let them rewild far too much. So can you just say, just kind of say a little bit more about how we get that message across that scrub is a valuable habitat, but maybe just not for these species, because it is a nuanced message, isn't it, in terms of the wider public?
Yeah, I'm absolutely devastated if that's what came across from my talk, the idea that, scrub is bad.
I'm slightly being cheeky, but you know what I mean.
My Kildahead Wildwood project, that's basically creating an upland scrub woodland. It's about complexity, and it's about, if we have enough complexity at a national scale, then there's enough room for everything. What the problem we have is that we have these small number relatively of areas that we're trying to do lots of conservation in, and so we're potentially in a position where we're competing for a bit of scrub next to a little bit of managed grassland beside a bare cliff, so we can have these in. But really, the problem for one is halcyon for another. But once we start working at a national level, then it becomes less of a problem because there is enough room and complexity. And I would hate the idea of actually taking down some of those trees along that cliff line, because if you go along the bottom of the cliffs at Humphrey Head, that bit of woodland there's amazing, undisturbed, inaccessible woodland, and it's causing problems, or has not been great for some of the plants that have lived on those cliffs. But I wouldn't want to be the one who made the decision to cut that scrub back. It's always a problem when you become talking about individual species. It's very easy to become species centric, and whatever is bad for that species is bad. And that's rarely the case. It's just that whatever's bad for that species has been allowed to or that species has been allowed to get into a point where something that is part of nature has become bad for it, as opposed to the other way around. So it is a nuanced message, and I could probably talk around it forever without giving you a definitive answer. But there's complexity is the key to everything, and the more room we have to be complex with our ecosystems within, the better off we'll be.
But I suppose the more sites that these species can be growing on, and the more places we can translocate them to, the more resilient it makes them then, doesn't it, from kind of local habitat changes, or the climate change issues you mentioned as well, I suppose. And then another one from Nigel, which is more of a local knowledge one. Are they on Hampsfell? This is Maidenhair fern again.
So I'm going to really show off my lack of local knowledge. I don't know where Hampsfell is. If they are, I'd be really interested to know what the habitat that might support them is, and I'd love to go and check it out.
It's above Grange.
Okay. Yeah.
There's parts of Hampsfell that I know very well, and I've never seen them there, but there's other parts of Hampsfell that I don't know. So let's keep looking. Yeah. And I think the same is true of Whitbarrow. Yeah.
So basically, I mean, again, people out on their walks, keeping an eye out, taking their local exercise. There's quite a network of volunteers, aren't they? Involved with Morecambe Bay Partnership, who can be your eyes in the places where we're all going for our local walks. I never knew they were in that funny little quarry past the Coast Guard station at Arnside. I know that really well, and I've never seen them there.
It's private land, so you're not really allowed onto it. So there's issues around that. But I think because the ones further along are so much more visible and easier to look at, I think there's no need for people to go into that little quarry.
Yeah. Okay. Another one is an interesting one, again, about Maidenhair fern. So, it is a fern you see in garden centres for sale. So, are those ones you see legitimately grown? I'm assuming they are, but you know, given the work that's been done to try and stop people buying, you know, peat-based compost, we can't always rely on the garden centres doing exactly the right thing. But do you know anything about that, about where they're coming from?
No, I don't. I don't know enough about that side of the. Yeah, I suspect that they are probably of like really diverse provenance, unlikely to be from local sources anymore. It might originally have been so. There might be some seed stock in garden centres that originally came from some Victorian collected Maidenhair fern, but I don't know enough about it to answer definitively.
Okay, thanks. And then the final one. This is a question from me. I do apologise. You showed a really good picture of your sort of jam jar grown Maidenhair ferns with the tiny little ones. I couldn't really get a sense for how many offspring you'd expect a fern in a jam jar to produce.
For me, like, this is a learning experience for me, and basically I put them in a jam jar, then transfer them into that big biscuit jar, and I was aware that a couple of the leaves had spores on the bottom, so I thought some of the spores might have developed, and then I thought, oh, it's all got a bit mossy in there. I thought the whole thing had become covered in liverworts down the bottom, so I was like, in the midst of talking to Anne, suggesting whether do I need to do something about the liverwort problem, she was like, oh, well, just wait a second, see what happens to some of those liverworts. And lo and behold, they weren't liverworts at all. They were the intermediate prothalli stage of the fern coming through. So I'm not sure if that was incredibly fortunate. I don't know, but I did at one point, the whole thing was covered in hundreds and hundreds. They've kind of thinned themselves out a little bit. I think they're probably forming roots and trying to find a little bit of limestone or tufa to attach to. But yeah, I apparently Anne said like, yeah, that can happen, or sometimes you can get none. And I think they might have done well in sterilising the soil or something, so they were able to beat off any kind of fungal attack. But yeah, really interesting plant to grow. That whole sort of spore prothalli into sort of small plantlet stage is really fascinating to watch. Can highly recommend it.
Yeah. So yeah, another one. This was about sundews, but I think the same is probably true of the other species as well. So can sundews be introduced in boggy gardens? And I guess, you know, just expanding on that question a little bit, you know, a lot of us who live around Morecambe Bay are quite lucky that we've got, you know, there's a lot of limestone in people's gardens. Often houses have been built where you couldn't have agriculture. So, you know, I mean, I've got limestone pavement in the back of my garden, for instance, that would feel quite good for Maidenhair fern as well. So are you actually inviting people to try and grow these species in back gardens?
It's different across the different species. So Maidenhair fern, very possibly, if you've got a suitable bit of limestone which is sheltered and moist enough through the year with sort of good indication that there's a general sort of reliable seepage of natural water through it, then absolutely, why not? Yeah, we'd be quite happy to explore that idea. I think that's around the fact that that's not going to change. There's not much you can do if you've got a lump of limestone and there's water seeping through it, then your gardening isn't going to do much about it. So it's, you know, we can happily do that. It's a little bit different with the idea of some of the other species, putting them in people's back gardens, because people move house, someone else might move in. We're looking for some form of long-term definite land management, which is kind of meaningless in terms of farming, because, you know, nothing in farming is that long-term. It changes on a 20-year cycle at the whims of the government, science, technology and everything like that. But the idea at least is that we are trying to sort of holistically and collectively move in the same direction. So yeah, yes, with ferns. With sundews, we're probably going to stick with doing work on bogs, mainly because there's a lot of effort, money going into restoring bogs, and so it kind of feeds more into that idea. However, if on your back garden you have what would have once been part of a peatland site, then I'd happily talk to you about what else you could do in that area, not just sundews. There's a whole host of wetland mire species which have gone missing because of the drying out of bogs over the years, and some really interesting ones that you can do all by yourself as well.
Yeah, thank you. A couple of kind of local knowledge questions now. So yeah, someone's noticed sundew growing in a a marginal notch boggy area at the foot of Cluffer near Lancaster, and is interested in whether they might be one of the rarer species. I know you put up your kind of 1 kilometre square type distributions of the different species of sundews. So do you know of any sort of down into Lancashire, around Lancaster?
I don't know of any, but if there have been, certainly if it's a suitable habitat, and like in years gone by, they would have been all the way up in those lowland bog areas. So there's every chance. If they were ever going to be passing again, I'd recommend almost request them to take a picture.
Yeah.
If it's roundleaf sundew, it's really quite obvious, because roundleaf sundew is distinctively smaller than the other two species. So it's quite easy to determine. Once if it was one of the other two, it can be quite hard to differentiate on a photograph for that reason.
But either one of the others is interesting to you, though, isn't it? That's the point. So
yeah, definitely. The other two are very much like scale of magnitude less less common. So yeah, really.
Yeah.
And certainly down in Lancashire, like I say, the Lancashire Wildlife Trust and the Northwest Rare Plants Initiative doing lots of work down there. So there'll be lots of local people down there who'd be interested to hear about it as well.
Yeah. Thank you. Probably we can end with a round of applause for Stephen. So thank you very much. Good. Thank you very much, everyone. We'll see you again, and get in touch with us. Get in touch with Michelle if you want to take part.